and death shall have no dominion. Dead men naked, they shall be one, with the man in the wind and the west moon, when their bones are picked clean and the clean bones gone. They shall have stars at elbow and foot. Though they go mad, they shall be sane. Though they sink through the sea, they shall rise again. Though lovers be lost, love shall not, and death shall have no dominion.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and we are joined by one of my favorite scholars in comparative religion and mythology, Acharya S, to discuss the topic, what happens when we die? How are you doing, Acharya?
No, hi there, Miguel. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Likewise. Great to have you on one more time, and I'm sure you'll be full of gnosis. So, Acharya, what I really want to ask you, and I remember kicking myself for not asking you this when we did our interview on the Gospel of Acharya, but what is your view of the afterlife, and are you afraid of death at all?
Well, this is a very important subject, obviously, and it's a big subject. I think that we don't talk about it enough because most people are afraid of death. Personally, when I'm speaking about this subject or writing about it, which I haven't done very much, but I am inclined to do so because not long ago, someone told me that they were dying, and I actually spoke to this individual. I don't know what the outcome was, but so far, but this person was basically in hospice, and I thought, well, what do I say to this person? I feel like I need to say something before he's gone. And I didn't know him personally very well. He's a follower of my work and very supportive of it. But it also reminded me of when my mother died, and I did speak to her. She too was in hospice. So I really wanted to speak about this issue because there's so much fear attached to it. And it's happening every single day. People are dying all over the world all the time. As we speak, someone is dying. And yet, most of these people are not prepared at all. It's just another one of our harshnesses and cruelties and brutalities of life on Earth that we don't prepare ourselves adequately for the most profound transition. It's the most frightening. It's, it's permanent. I mean, in the sense that for sure this body is going to decay and dissipate, and you will no longer be occupying it. We know that. That's a fact. My own personal experiences of this process, when I'm speaking about this subject, I'm not going to pretend to be some omniscient prophet who knows what's going to happen to every individual on the planet when they die. That's not my purpose. I can tell you my experiences of contemplating death, of speaking with people who are dying, and I can tell you what has happened, what people have conceived of the process all around the world in cultures dating back thousands of years. These concepts, I believe, are really important to have in your mind because in order to make have an informed experience in life, you would need to study as much data, absorb as much data as possible. Just ignoring the subject and pretending it doesn't exist, or having some pat answers handed to you by someone else in somebody's holy books that someone wrote thousands of years ago, are not producing the kind of experience that is fully informed, awake, and kind. And it's part of this harshness and cruelty that we many of us will die in fear. And of course, the fear of termination is the major problem, and that is a natural perspective to have. Nobody wants to be terminated. We have this fear because we know innately that it's a termination. But religious systems over the millennia have tried to mitigate that termination by insisting that it's more like a doorway. And I don't see a problem with knowing about these perspectives, the differences of the different cultures from around the world. In fact, I think it's important and healthy to know as much as you can about human beliefs. Not suggesting that we subscribe to them. The idea of annihilation being what happens when we die is also valid. That would be something like a skeptical, atheistic perspective. We are worm food and nothing happens afterwards and there's nobody left and nobody home. That is another perspective that we have to add into the database. And I do look at life in this way, especially with something this profound that we're so afraid of discussing. I like to look at it in a more dispassionate and anthropological way of crunching data rather than, having my personality involved in it and biting my nails and being terrified. Because obviously it doesn't frighten me because I'm sitting here expressing how I've pondered it. Not obsessively, obviously. I don't suggest anyone be obsessed with pondering death. It's not definitely not a healthy perspective either. But closing our ears and eyes to it and not having any idea of transitions that have been already reckoned with previously, wrestled with, whatever you want to call it, that's not a healthy perspective either. And this is causing people to go to their deathbed in terror. Obviously, I'm not a professional hospice worker, so I can't tell you how to deal with an individual on a personal level. I myself have deal with, but I've had to deal with people dying around me, and I know you have too. And as you get older, it's going to happen more and more. In fact, it's like every week, somebody I've grown up with, or either in my personal life or in my life, somebody famous has just died, and and we're constantly like feeling loss, and it's sort of like a shedding of our bits of ourselves as we go along. So this is something that the great philosophers over the centuries have pondered. It's one of the great mysteries, and it's one of the most vexatious aspects of our human existence. I don't think many other species are confronted with this awareness of their own impending death, unless, of course, it's right upon them, and they've seen it happening to other creatures in their groups. So obviously they have a fear of animals instinctively have a fear of death, which is why when something's chasing them, they run like crazy. They're like, hey, what? This is just a transition, man. Go easy. We don't see too many people offer themselves up like that either. Hey, I can't wait to get to the other side. Give it to me now. We have suicide bombers, and they're obsessed with death, and because they've been made these promises, and they have nothing to live for on this side. If you abuse someone into hating life in the material world, turn them into a Gnostic. There you go.
The Gnostics were against martyrdom, not like the early Christians. They were for.
I know, but they really hated the demiurge of this world.
Yeah, that is true.
This world is harsh. There's no doubt about it, and we're not making it any less harsh. I'm trying to make it less harsh by having this discussion. Now, you abuse someone in this life and tell them that there's another life coming, and it's got all the things that you can't have here. But you can see other people getting, though. Otherwise, you wouldn't even know how great they were if you didn't say, hey, look at that guy over there. He's got 20 women, and he's really enjoying himself.
Golden streets and houses and, all that.
Oh, yeah. Well, mostly it's the virgins and whatnot, whatever. I mean, it really has a lot to do with sex, let's face it. Or tempting them with being able to eat. Whatever appeals to the worst aspects of humanity, that's what you get in heaven. So you can eat all you want without getting fat. Yay! Let's appeal to gluttony. That's really what you see with a lot of these these depictions of heaven are things that people want here. And that really is the cultural core to this whole field of study that I find to be fascinating. For example, it really depends. This is why I want everybody to look at the broader picture. It really depends on where you were born and what era, that what you will perceive as happening to you when you die. For example, in countries where you're in a desert and it's really, really hot, then hell is hot. But if you're in a country where it's freezing cold, hell is cold. And you see how easy that is, right? It's logical. This is the thing. It's logical. It's not necessarily the truth. It's not necessarily divine, some kind of divine message that we're getting direct from the source. It's a perspective from the logical, often logical perspective from that humanity has broadened, has described and depicted. And entire cultures have been created based on these perceptions, including, for example, the ancient Egyptian culture. In large part, many of the monuments that we see were designed to facilitate a transition into a more permanent state. They were reflective of permanence. They were a quest for immortality. The pyramids, for example, at Giza have been called by Egyptologists resurrection machines. And interestingly enough, of course, they're tied to the sun, S-U-N. And so the sun is seen as a source of eternal life that resurrects through the death of winter into the life of spring. And so a lot of our religions have been tied into this life cycle. We've seen the death, but we've also seen the spring. And we're trying to get to the spring constantly through the death. And so when you look at it that way, it's logical, it's uplifting, it's inspiring. It doesn't drive people to do insane things like blow up other people in the public square. There's no nonsense about gold-paved streets and orgies of eating and dozens of virgins. It's no promise of some fancy car on the other side or a room in heaven with a view.
Yeah, or singing hymns to Jehovah. I never understood that one. That's like the most boring fate anybody could have. That's hell.
That reminds me of a story, a short story here. This friend of mine was Catholic, and she just passed away not long ago. But years ago, I was talking to her, and she had constant illnesses, and she finally said to me one time, "Oh, I can't wait to die and go to heaven and meet my sweet Jesus." And I said, "Well, that would be my hell."
Acharya, I've got to have a word for you.
No, you know what she said, and she said, she spelled it out. I'm not going to spell it out, but she said, "F you." And we just started laughing and laughing because it was just so funny. He's a devout Catholic saying "F you" to me, but my point was exactly what you're saying. To sit at the feet of this giant male figure, and he either has a long hairy face and a beard, long hair, or no face at all, and to sit there and strum a harp all day long. This is not my idea of heaven. Basically, in that sense, I think we're looking at a free-for-all as far as what everyone on the planet wants to perceive as heavenly reward. Obviously, the concepts of heaven and hell have been developed and used mightily by priesthoods around the world. And we find these ideas going back thousands of years prior to the Christian era. Christianity does not come up with them. Heaven and hell are found quite explicitly in the Egyptian and Zoroastrian religion, for example. In Greek religion, there's quite a colorful depiction of the underworld with Hades and all these characters going in and out, and we know these stories, and they had a great deal to do. They were part of the religion, of ancient Greece. We call them myths now, but they were the Greek religion, and entire buildings and monuments were created for these gods, and hymns were sung to them, and this went on for hundreds of years. And they were quite sure that their religion was the right one, if you can see where I'm going here. Same thing with the Egyptians and the Romans and the Indians, and the Buddhists have an afterlife concept depending on the different sects.
Well, what's interesting is that the Jews didn't have a concept of an afterlife at first. They were pretty nihilistic until later on.
Yeah, there's a strange dichotomy going on there, because Judaism comes off as very xenophobic and claims to be so closed off to the rest of the world, when in fact it continuously was influenced by different religions and is a product of other cultures as well, like the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Mesopotamian stories. And they had their stories of, you have Tammuz being worshipped or mourned, and he's Dumuzi, and the Sumerian, that's in Ezekiel, by the way, Tammuz. And the Sumerian, he goes underground into the underworld and rises out again, and with Inanna, his mother consort. So these ideas are definitely in the Jewish psyche, but they're kind of just like this constant castigating for whoring after other gods that you find throughout the Old Testament. These afterlife concepts are really sublimated, but they do have that dichotomy that really stands out in the New Testament, that is very Zoroastrian, between the good and the evil, and the dark god and the light god and whatnot. So yeah, the heaven and the hell. So there are these horrible hellish stories dating back, and they all have different depictions of what will be hell. You can be tortured in eternal hellfire, especially if you're in the Middle East, right? As I discussed, the heat is a big factor in these stories, but in other climates, it's the cold. So, and basically, I think that depends on where you are and what area you're in, that if you're going to try to get people to behave around you, and then notice that some people are just really sociopathic, kicking them in the butt is not going to help. They're still going to act badly. We know that heaven and hell are created, fleshed out, if you will, by priestly factions in order to manipulate the masses. We have the greed for the heaven with all the gold and the booty. And then we have the hell, which is, torture, whatever you think is going to be the most effective torture for the people you're talking to. I mean, if you're in the middle of wintertime in the Arctic Circle, and you tell the people that they're going to be roasting by a fire, they'll be like, hooray, give us hell. You have to kind of adjust your stories. What's their worst fear? Freezing to death, perhaps. So, hell's really 10 times as cold as what you're experiencing now. So the same thing could be somebody is living in a watery lagoon, and hell would be just endless fields of water, just a sea of water, and there's no getting out of it. This is where looking at all the different cultures and knowing what people have perceived over the millennia is very helpful to the individual in dealing with this transition. Rather than, well, this holy book says I'm going to be going here, or I'm going to go to hell because of this and that. Now, granted, just for the sake of it, whether or not you're going to get punished after death, it's not a good idea to be committing crimes and causing horror and atrocity and grief to other creatures whenever you can, whether they're human or not. We try to minimize our causation of suffering. But to have a hellish experience that is going to happen to you afterwards because you swore once when you were a kid, have some hideous, you're building up all these horrible things that are going to, the average person is average because they don't do terrible, horrible things all the time. Yet they have to suffer this awful guilt and shame and fear. And again, this is one of the reasons why people are terrified. They're not only terrified of death because it's termination, they're terrified because they've been terrorized with these stories since they were small children. Imagine you telling a child that if he or she doesn't do something as simple as not blaspheming the Lord, saying something like, "Oh my God," well, that's going to get you some penalty in hell. We're creating neurotic, terrified. This is terrorism. This is spiritual terrorism. It's child abuse. Telling children this, and so now this is what we have. We have people who are terrified of dying because they're afraid they're going to go to hell and be punished for all eternity for even ridiculous infractions. And this is one of the reasons why people are afraid of confronting the material that I've brought up with my comparative religion studies and saying things like, Jesus Christ is a mythical figure, for example. They're terrified because they think they're going to be punished for even thinking that way, and much less to do what I'm doing, which is immersing myself in this thought day and night by searching through texts dating back thousands of years. One of the reasons why I'm not terrified, first of all, I wasn't terrorized by these stories as a child. Secondly, I was inoculated against them because I studied mythology. As a small child, I became fascinated with Greek mythology. And the other thing is that in this world here and now, I've come to a point, and I'm old enough, I've come to a point where my actions are very clean. Every once in a while I'll do things like, shoot, I wish I hadn't said that, or I wish I didn't do that. But they're very minor things. We're not perfect, and we live on planet Earth, so I don't expect perfection out of anybody. But I'm not running around harming people. I try to minimize my footprint, so to speak, in many ways. And I don't get into people's faces. In fact, in my daily life, in person, with real human beings, as opposed to the internet, I'm very friendly and nice. I'm 10 times as friendly and nice to most people I encounter who are kind of like all stiff and fearful. Like, hey, howdy there, talk to me like that.
Well, what happened? You were a born-again Christian for a while. Did your view change at all?
Yeah, I was all tense and fearful.
It wasn't fun.
No, that was a horrible hair shirt to wear. Yuck. That's why they call it a hair shirt. Ay, ay, ay. Yeah, no, it couldn't stick, though, because I've always, I came from good people, good stock. These are decent, hardworking people. I don't have any guilty feelings like that, and you can't make me have guilty feelings like that. And so, in fact, I have faced down death on a number of occasions. I've had these periods of illness. God, I don't know. The next one that happens, it'll probably kill me. And they've gone on for years, not just months. I mean, I've had a couple of times when it's been tough. Every day, I thought I was just going to die. I know you've had these anxiety feelings, and but
right.
You feel really nauseated, like where you're like right at the edge of vomiting. You know that feeling?
Oh yeah,
it's just coming in waves for days on end. Because at that moment when you're feeling that sick, you feel like you're going to die. You're just barely holding on to your body.
Sometimes it's worse than death. It feels worse than death.
Yeah, that like being seasick. That's horrible, and that's possibly a way that many people are going to leave the planet, in that kind of hideous seasick feeling. And wow, and so I'd like to see a nicer transition than that. The anxiety and the fear that accompanying it. We don't know where we're going. Nobody's prepared us. We're completely unprepared. We're supposed to go and learn all about how to everything from tying your shoes to balancing your bank account to investing and everything like that. But nothing, no preparation for death except for some stuff that people tell us out of a book 2,000 years old. But what about listening to people who are dealing with it every day, like hospice workers? How about people who are actually experiencing it? Can they describe it for us? People I've spoken to are in that process are not, unfortunately, they're not very articulate because they got them all doped up in the hospice route. There have been some really great visionaries who have done some crazy things. Aldous Huxley took LSD when he was on the edge of dying. I don't know what the result of that was, but just having expressions of what's happening the best you can to describe it, that would be helpful to us. But also paying attention, not necessarily subscribing to these beliefs, but paying attention again to all of the concepts that have come out of religions and mythology over the past several thousand years. We even know that, for example, Neanderthal had some sort of spiritual concept, because they buried their dead and they put trinkets into the grave. And that indicates something. So let's look at what it indicates. It's a primitive concept. It's a hope for a continuation of some sort. We have stories of people communicating with people in the afterlife, ghosts and whatnot. I don't see a reason why we can't look at those stories. Whether or not they'll fit your perspective of reality is a different question, but we need to look at all these things. And I love looking at these things. I don't necessarily make any kind of conclusion. I don't hold them next to my heart as gospel truth. I don't have to view reality in that way, but I like looking at them. That's science, to know. Science, you can't know something, whether it's good or bad, or to throw it away, discard it. You can't know it unless you actually dig right into it. So ignoring it is not the way. Ignorance is not helping. But we can listen to people talking about these experiences as well. And that, all of that helps the transition. When I was facing this like a daily, I even had one kind of a feeling like that today where I was very kind of nauseated. The one thing that I felt, the fear that I felt was not necessarily leaving, because I'm sure you know this feeling that as you get older and the body starts to rip and tear.
Yeah.
Things are, I'm nursing a torn muscle somewhere like every day. That at a certain point, you know that it's just basically, look, I'm going to lie down and go to sleep now, and I ain't coming back. This is what dying with dignity is all about. You just get tired. You just like, but where the panic and the fear comes in those circumstances, and that's a good death. Okay, that's what they would call euthanasia. That's what the word euthanatos, euthanasia. It means good death. It doesn't mean that you have to stick a needle in your arm. The whole concept of it would be to be able to go and die in dignity, relaxed, at peace with yourself and your surroundings. That would be nice. Unfortunately, very few people have that luxury, and with the people who are traumatically killed, that's obviously out of the question, and that's just a horrible thing. But to have that good death, if we are so fortunate to get to that point, rather than being terrified, I haven't finished what I came here to do. What about my children? I've left behind this and that. And these are thoughts that go through your mind. You're not necessarily afraid of your own annihilation, although that is certainly a factor, but you're also just afraid of what you're leaving behind and how you're going to affect those people. And that is the biggest fear that I felt, which kept me alive. Now, several times now, I've been like pushed up to the edge. Many times. I lost count. So yeah, what comes up in a person's mind, at least in my experience, when they're pushed against the wall of death, imminent death, is a fear of what you've left behind, including, in my case, I kept thinking about certain people who were still alive, like my mother at the time. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? What am I going to do to her by dying? It would just be the worst thing imaginable for her to lose her daughter. And so here I was thinking of them. How would this affect them? And that was my fear. That was the biggest fear. Leaving the world is our problem. We on the one hand, life can be miserable here. On the other hand, we don't want to go. We go kicking and screaming into that dark night. And so we actually enjoy being alive. We know that we instinctively know, like the animals do, that, hey, that's the end. Whether or not something remains is the eternal question. This is the mystery. Again, I'm not going to pretend to be able to tell each individual what remains and what will be passed on. And scientifically we look at it and say, well, we are all eternal in the sense that everything is atoms vibrating, and our molecules will dissipate and we will be absorbed into something else, and in that manner we are eternal. But is there any substance of this persona that I call Acharya going to be retained? Can it be passed along into another life, for example? The belief in reincarnation is strong on this planet. It has been for thousands of years in many cultures. people are afraid to look at that because they've been brainwashed by one cult or another that says reincarnation is a bad idea. And then let's look at this heaven over here where you get to sit at the feet of Jesus and play the harp all the time
for millions of years.
Look over here. It's one distraction and deflection after another. I see no problem with looking at the concept of reincarnation. I think it's a fascinating idea. There are some studies of people, children, who have said some pretty amazing things, very detailed stories, and almost anyone I'll talk to has some kind of past life sensation, at least, that they've had, even a deja vu where you've gone, wait a second, I feel like I was there. How could I have been there? Looking at a photo might trigger this. I remember looking at a photo as a child of a sunken ship in a port in Scandinavia, and I had this very strong feeling that I had died in that sunken ship. This was a kid. I didn't know anything about reincarnation. I didn't know anything. The only thing I knew was that I had Scandinavian genetics, but I wasn't thinking at the time, hey, I have Scandinavian genetics. Maybe I died in that. It just occurred to me as I was staring at this picture. It was just a flood of this. Did I do anything with that information? No, but I just recall it. I didn't go out and start a cult and tell people, hey, reincarnation is real and we all better believe in it or we're going to go to hell, huh?
You'd have more money in your bank account if you'd done that. So, silly girl.
Yes, I can pretend that I know all the answers to the mysteries, and therefore you must come to me and sit at my feet and pony up while you're here. But I know a lot of people who have had those experiences, and a number of them have been Christians, and they're afraid to talk about it or look at it because of this fear that's been instilled in them. Which again, here we go again, with not being prepared for death and being terrified and terrorized as a child and yada yada. One of my favorite experiences over the years of doing this work with the Christian mythology, where I've gotten a lot of flack. I had an email some years ago from an elderly couple. I had a couple of them. They sent me over a period of a month or two. Wanted to contact me after having read my book, Christ Conspiracy, which was published in 1999, and which I am revising, by the way, The Christ Conspiracy. So they had read this book each a couple of times and then out loud to each other. And so this was at elderly people. And they were very old because they told me they were both they had one foot in the grave when they wrote to me. So I'm quite sure they're deceased by now. But they said they had to write to me to thank me because reading that book helped them remove the fear, guilt, and shame that they had been feeling for just being alive from Christian conditioning. And they said they could now die in peace. And I never heard from them again. I was so thrilled to hear this because I had other people telling me, why do you want to say this to people? You're stealing their hope away from them. I was like, well, look what they've said. They said, I'm helping them remove their fear, guilt, and shame for just being alive. Okay, so I don't think I'm stealing anybody's hope here by telling them that other cultures have these concepts, and we can look at all those other cultures. In fact, that gives them more hope because they don't have to be, look, it's black and white. We got this particular version of heaven and this particular version of hell, and that's all there is. And if you don't believe in it, then you get that particular version of hell.
Yeah.
I mean, this is spiritual fascism. It's mental tyranny. And there's the one thing I would like to express to people, and I did do this with both my mother as she was passing and other individual more recently. The one thing I would like people to do when they're in this situation is to allow their minds to go freely where they want to go. Don't sit there thinking, well, I can't can't contemplate heaven because I'm an atheist. I can't contemplate reincarnation because I'm a skeptic. I can't contemplate annihilation because I'm a Christian. All of these concepts, your brain is going to go into overload and you can be terrified. You know, if I think this certain way on my deathbed, aren't I going to go to hell for all eternity? This is where we are not behaving in an enlightened manner as concerns death and dying, and where there needs to be a tremendous amount of improvement. Because sooner or later, everybody is going to face it, either with someone around them going through it or their own mortality. I remember as a small child, the first encounter I had with death was very young, in fact, but the memory is seared in me because of its imagery. I don't remember any words that were said, but my great-grandfather was a very thin, old white man, about 93 years old, and he was lying in his hospital bed. So he's on the white sheets, he's white, he's very gray. He looked like a skeleton, very thin, very long. And so basically, you know, I mean, I have this memory. This is what it looks like. You're a skeleton in a bed, basically. So, you know, we all have got to encounter this concept, even with pets. How many pets have you had that have died?
Oh, too many. Yeah, they don't live long.
Yeah, it goes on and on. I mean, you're constantly encountering death. So being free to contemplate the possibilities will help mitigate that fear. When I was staring at death in the face so many times, I didn't knuckle under and I'll say, "Oh, I'm a sinner," and I start weeping and wailing and being terrified of hell and taking back everything. Believe me, when someone like me is facing death, where I've spent my life analyzing religious beliefs and doubting them, you know, you could say that I should have been terrified out of my mind, when in fact I wasn't. Like I said, the one thing that really bothered me was leaving behind just things undone. And if I had died at that time, of course, I wouldn't have created everything I have since then. And so that fear was very justified. But just being able to, even if you're on the verge of dying, and just not having that being terrified that something you've done or said or thought is going to drag you into hell for all eternity. Now, there is an interesting concept in Tibetan Buddhist mythology, and that has to do with mind hells. And I don't know all the details, but this is how I have perceived this idea of a mind hell. That unresolved issues, like maybe a disease in the body, you know, they may have a lingering effect of, that might be all that's left of you when you die, are unresolved issues that you've left behind. You know, and those alone can constitute a sort of hell, a mind hell. But they're not permanent, because if they are resolved, it's like a knot, you know. If a knot is untied, finally, it's resolved and it's no more. So if these issues are resolved, then it's dissipation. This is the idea that I got from, I'm not saying it's true as concerns some kind of afterlife, but it's another one of these concepts that people have come up with, that this mind hell can go on, and it can go on. It's self-perpetuating, like an anxiety attack. But at an instant when it's resolved, poof, you're out of hell. You're in heaven. You're relaxed, you're peaceful. So you can actually sort of set the stage, so to speak, in having your good death and being in a peaceful place. And here we come to these other concepts of troubled souls who've been traumatized out of their bodies, have not left peacefully, and are still hanging around, that you find within tales of ghosts and goblins and demons and so forth. These are all concepts we can look at. Like, again, I'm not saying that they're real or that there's any truth to them, but they are human concepts. They're concepts that have struck the human psyche at one point or another, and they're interesting to look at because they will reveal not necessarily a reality that's happening somewhere on the other side, but they do reveal how human beings think. And they're data that we need to incorporate into our worldview in order to process our lives in a more effective manner. These other kinder, gentler concepts of being able to resolve these issues rather than being thrown into hell permanently and tortured for all eternity for something that maybe a really small infraction, no good God would not give you a chance to get out of that scene, It's ridiculous. How can you consider good and merciful and compassionate if you stood no chance in ever getting out of hell because when you were, 10 years old, you called the little boy next door a name?
I think one of my favorite arguments by fundies is when they say, well, since God is eternal love, if you reject eternal love, then you get eternal damnation. Very skewed, very skewed.
Well, it makes no sense. I mean, if you can experience the sensation of love, well, that's heaven, isn't it? That's heavenly. What else do we need? We like the sensation of love. It's love. I mean, what the heck? So you would not be in hell if you're experiencing love, right?
Exactly.
Like my hell is full of love. Huh? Okay. So what's your heaven full of? There you go. Different time and place. If you're a loving person, your transgressions. You're a human being. You're going to have transgressions. You're not destined to any eternal hell. You're going to create your own hell here if you're not a loving person. And it's really nasty people creating hell on earth that we're, and it's a perpetuating thing because children are tormented, children are abused, they grow up to be abusers. Something like 90% of prisoners in, I think it was the United States, a study was done, have stated that they were abused children. And so
Wow.
They act in a certain way, and it's understandable. This is a chronic issue. But they're being abused not only by physical means in their home life, but also by all of these religious notions of spiritual terrorism. On the one hand, the concept of a God punishing you for all eternity it might be helpful in some instances when you're talking about people who just are really badly formed. They really cannot act properly. No innate morality, no empathy. You're talking sociopaths. But even then, if he's a sociopath, he's not going to respond to your threats of hell. So it comes back to this device used to get the evil people, so to speak, in line is now being used to bludgeon all the innocent people. And, we see the results of that everywhere. Just people are afraid to live. They're afraid to die. They're afraid. I think one of the main ways that we can get beyond this fear is to look boldly at the data and make up our own minds and decide whether or not we want to have not only a good life to the best of our ability, but also a good death if we're so lucky to live, long under our own measures, rather than having somebody take us out or get into a horrible accident or something. And this is a very big subject, and it's not fleshed out enough. We haven't faced it clearly enough. We're all going to have to look at it, and I think increasingly so in the future, because there's some real troubling times ahead of us. And even down to simple things like that have to do with death. We've spoken about religious cults, and I'm using this anthropological term, cult, like in antiquity, where they're talking about the different sects of any given religion. The Greek, for example, you have the cult of the divine birth, for example, the cult of in other parts of the Roman Empire. The Mithraic cult actually was an undertaker's religion.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yes. That's why they were under the ground in their Mithraea, under the Mithraians. Because undertakers throughout history have been very wealthy. You can imagine with good reason, because who the heck wants to do that job?
Yeah.
And people are dying all the time, so there's no,
No recession.
There's no lack of customers. And, we can make light of these things, but, that's also healthy, too, because, like I said, nobody wants to be sitting around obsessing on death. But the Undertaker cult has been, I'm actually quite grateful to the people who they really are in a world of their own. And they're doing a great service to humanity. They are the ones who come up with all these rituals, and they come up with the Book of the Dead. The Egyptian religion is full of mortuary spells designed to appease the spirits, to help the transition. This is, we could do a whole other show on the actual specifics of death transition myths and texts and so forth, of how they've been able to, over thousands of years, this has been compiled to make this transition to eternity. Everybody wants eternity and immortality. And so there are all these mechanisms by which people are supposed to be able to achieve that. And knowing about all of them, as many as we can, is, I think, very healthy. Again, just crunching the data, not necessarily believing them. We already have the opposite end of the spectrum is easily summed up. The skeptical, atheistic perspective, it's, annihilation. There is nobody there afterwards. Nothing is retained. Nothing remains. So we already know that perspective. We have that in our minds. We know it from just our innate fear of death. We know, something is annihilated, obviously, at that point. This experience is unquestionably annihilated. So we already know that. But looking at all the other devices and mechanisms and concepts is, again, healthy thing to do. And I think it would be very helpful for people. I think it would be helpful for us to be more expressive of our concerns in this regard, to be more prepared whenever we can be for this transition. And it will help to create a kinder, gentler world for us all.
I certainly agree. Oh, and before we go, Acharya, what else do you have coming up the pipe?
Well, I've got out this new astrotheology calendar, the 2012 astrotheology calendar, which goes through various artifacts from around the world, archaeological sites, and shows their astronomical alignments. And these are sacred sites, so that's the astrotheology part. So it's got a lot of really great images. The images are very useful in showing what I've been trying to express for so many years in my writings. And so that's out. And then I've also got a DVD out, which is a kind of a home-spunny sort of conversation, but a lot of really good, juicy stuff. The whole thing is me, with images interspersed, obviously. And so these are all available on my websites, truthbeknown.com, stellarhousepublishing.com, freethoughtnation.com is where you can find the DVD. I haven't put it up in the other places yet, but I will. And then there's a film festival release of a really cool documentary called God in the Box. And the last time I checked anyway, I was featured in it, surprisingly. I'm sort of tying in all of the disparate ideas that people have come up with when they've gone into this box to tell about their concepts of God or no God. And then also I am busily working on a revision for my classic bestseller, The Christ Conspiracy. And I have so much material I can hardly squeeze it all in there. It's just the whole field has exploded in the last decade plus. Unbelievable. Artifacts coming out and studies being done and published dissertations and so forth. It's just, even though it's heavily denied, this mythicist field, there is so much information in it now, and I'm trying to put this into this new book, or this revision. It's going to be tough, but hopefully it'll come out before I die.
Oh, I'm sure it will.
I can't leave things behind,
Yeah, exactly. You'll end up in some Buddhist hell.
Exactly.
Or haunting us. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today, Acharya. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on and giving us a very important and stimulating talk on, like you said, one of the main events in our lives.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. As usual, you've inspired me, and it's been a lot of fun, even though the subject matter is dreary. But see, that's the point, isn't it? It is a horrible, appalling subject matter, and yet it's been going on a really long time, and there is some wisdom involved in what prior cultures and eras have perceived, and we can look at it. And that depth of knowledge and wisdom and creation, human creation, can actually give us a more solid platform from which to operate and a much more stable perspective, so we're not terrified all the time and terrorized.
Exactly. The fear of death has brought a lot of problems to our world, but like you said, if we can come to terms with it, it'll be a smoother ride until then.
That's right. So peace upon everyone.